Welcome back to Eye on Iowa. I'm Sarah Mueller, a reporter with Forbes, and today I am joined by Professor Kelly Shaw with Iowa State University's Political Science Department. Thank you so much for joining me. We're going to talk a little bit about just the role of the presidency and maybe some perceptions about the upcoming election because we have a tight race right now, it feels like, between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, considering that Donald Trump is leading so far ahead in the polls. Just overall, can you give us an initial kind of vibe check of where we're at here in Iowa, almost 2 weeks ahead of the caucuses?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be along with you today. Yeah, the presidency has really excelled in terms of the amount of power that they've gotten, not only delegated to them from Congress, but also constitutionally as well. We know in terms of foreign powers, the president is almost unchecked in terms of some of the things that he and hopefully someday she can do in terms of foreign powers, but also in terms of domestic policy, which kind of surprisingly this campaign has focused fairly heavily on, given the border wall and the economy and whatnot, but also in terms of domestic policy. The executive has received more power as well. Not only delegated to him, but also the power that the president is able to do in terms of kind of legislating from his office, be that through the direction of executive agencies or through the signing of executive orders or what have you. So I think we've seen, Sarah, certainly the last 30 years, the amount of power that the president has at the domestic level increase. And again, the Constitution in Article 2, we won't get too political sciencey, but the Constitution, Article 2, really spells out the dramatic powers that the president has in terms of the foreign realm. So we kind of see that coming together in today's environment. As you know, as a reporter, and as your viewers know as well, we're very highly polarized right now. That polarization started before the Trump campaign back in 2016. But has accelerated certainly from that time. And so it's kind of a perfect storm, if you will, Sarah, in terms of the amount of power that has been given to the president, again, both through the delegated powers and as well as those constitutional powers, but also in terms of the polarization that we see that continues to manifest itself across all different spectrums of the political universe, if you will. So we see more polarization in our elected officials, more polarization in the population, certainly more polarization in the elites as well. And so I think that the direction of the United States and this presidency really kind of go hand in hand with this polarization element. And we see that play out in Iowa and other places as well. As you mentioned in your intro, President Trump does have commanding leads, certainly here in we like to call it the Cyclone State, but here in the Hawkeye State has a commanding lead. And so the fight really here is for second place. And we can get into the caucuses a little bit more and the expectations there. But what happens after they leave Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and then moving through this kind of progression of caucuses, we'll begin to see the race kind of be whittled down to maybe one or two different competitors. Certainly, Donald Trump is in there for the long run. I think that when we look at the other candidates here in Iowa and their attempts to finish higher than predicted, that's really what they hope to do in terms of their campaigns, is finish higher than predicted. So that they can be viewed as a contender moving forward against Mr. Trump. I think that's really what we're focusing on here. So the polarization, the fact that Mr. Trump lost to Mr. Biden back in 2020, and the fact that he's back again and has this commanding lead. And likewise as well, Sarah, the fact that the Dems, while they'll rally behind the president, are not all that excited about him running for a second term. I think there's a lot of balls in the air when it comes to this campaign. So kind of the perfect storm here in Iowa and other places as well, as we focus on the November elections and who exactly is going to be there, particularly for the Republicans.
The caucuses are really focused on party matter, right? We talk about the Republican caucus and the or primary and the Democratic caucus. And I wonder, I was having a conversation with a colleague recently about how do we define Republicans post Trump? Is there a difference in what the party looks like post Trump in 2016? And is that turning off moderates or independents to caucus Republican or GOP in this upcoming, 2 weeks as we face maybe another Biden Trump face off? And so, what does the party look like right now as Republicans or maybe moderates are looking to caucus Republican, vote Republican? Is it a different world post 2016?
I think it's a different world post 2020, probably, Sarah. 2016, I think there were a lot of questions about Trump, but a lot of people were willing to kind of dismiss some of his weaknesses as a candidate, as an executive. The drain the swamp and build the wall rhetoric really resonated with a lot of persons who were concerned about the direction of the country and felt, since the 1800s, we've had presidents who were from the parties, and Mr. Trump certainly characterized himself as an outside person looking into that. I think we found out during his presidency, during the first 2 years from 2016, 2017, 2018, he attempted to implement a lot of his policies, but he wasn't very successful. And in political science, that's largely kind of that honeymoon period where the president had control of both the House and the Senate there. But some of the distractions that he had allowed for some kinks in that Republican armor, if you will. And so we begin to see people, not just Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, but other people in both the House and the Senate begin to kind of question the direction of the party. And certainly the party itself, and I tell my colleagues a lot of times that the only thing saving the Republican Party is the fact that the Democratic Party is largely split apart as well. But we do see increasingly, and it's probably not enough, but we do see increasingly candidates now who are running around Iowa trying to separate themselves from the president. Now, none of them will come right out and say anything negative. And in fact, President Trump, or now candidate Trump, has run some really amazing ads here in the state of Iowa that not only paint our governor in somewhat of a negative light, but also Mr. DeSantis, Governor DeSantis, in a bit of a negative light, in that they endorsed him during the first cycle and again in 2020 as well. So he's kind of using those sound bites, and you as a journalist know these sound bites never disappear, kind of using these sound bites to say, look here, I am the mainstream candidate now for the party. At the same time, we see other people like Ambassador Haley, who is, of course, served as ambassador under the Trump administration, UN, but at the same time has tried to separate herself from some of these policies. And it's interesting from a political science perspective and from kind of old guy with gray hair, hearing Governor or Ambassador Haley talk about old age. And I think really, as we begin to hear her kind of voice herself the last 2 weeks here, we're going to continue to see her kind of try to split away from the DeSantis and Trumps and others and say, look, I am kind of the banner carrier for the new Republican Party, a younger Republican Party, a Republican Party that is more outward looking in terms of foreign policy, but still some of those main conservative elements that Republicans tend to consider as important platforms in terms of the economy.
I think the conversation around Donald Trump this election season has been about the baggage, right? We talk about, he ran a campaign in 2020 and came out as the nominee, but did not come out as the winner. And we talk about the baggage of January 6th. We talk about, the impeachment. We talk about now his legal battles. How is that still resonating with some voters? Well, a lot of voters, if we look at the polls, that, what does this baggage look like considering, we talk about DeSantis being maybe Trump without the baggage, or Vivek is Trump without the baggage. What is the role of that baggage as it is attached to his presidency?
That's a great question, Sarah. And we don't see it so much in the campaign. I've not seen, and I'm on semester break right now, so I've been watching more television than normal. But I've not seen any candidate come out and mention the fact that it's a red flag that President Trump has been removed from ballots in both Maine and Colorado. I think they kind of continue to expect some of this drama around some of the legal questions that surround both him and his presidency, but they've not really attacked that. In fact, to the contrary, most of the leaders here in Iowa, the second and third place persons, have come out and said, this is overreach by the courts, which is really kind of an odd thing when you think about kind of the cut neck politics that is going on right now, and that they want to defeat Trump, but they don't want to come out and really kick a guy when he's down, or at least make that a big deal. So one of the things that we look at political scientists is that this is a really unique situation, right, Sarah, in the sense that we have a person who served one term, was defeated, and now has come back and looks, for all intents and purposes, to be the nominee, unless something miraculously happens. And so they kind of deal with him with gloves on, if you will. And so there's not really a gloves off moment. Now, some of the political spending that we see in the next couple of weeks here in Iowa, and then of course in New Hampshire as well, might kind of question some of that rhetoric. But right now, most of the negative ads that we see are being kicked back and forth between Governor DeSantis and, of course, Ambassador Haley there. So who finishes second and who finishes third is really important to these campaigns moving forward. But we still see that kind of awkward romance, if you will, and maybe romance is a bad word to call, but kind of an awkward relationship with President Trump, despite the fact that, of course, they have spent millions and millions of dollars here in Iowa and New Hampshire and some of the other early states to defeat the guy. So it's really an odd situation to watch, not only historically in the sense that we've not had a defeated candidate come back, but we also have a party that is really split between those centrists, those Nikki Haley's, if you will, and those Liz Cheney's, if you will, and the Mitt Romney's, if you will, who kind of see centrist policies for the Republican Party as the way forward, versus those who are diehard Trumps. Getting to your question, though, I think there is a lot of conspiracy theory. There is a lot of distrust from the media, no offense, that we see particularly amongst some of the very conservative Trump followers. They tend not to trust the news stories that they hear. And then when it's confirmed, right, that something bad has happened within Trump's life or within the Trump's campaign, once that is confirmed, then they say, it's a witch hunt. And the president has used this terminology as well since he left office in 2020. And so, lots of political baggage being drug around. If I was a campaign advisor, which thankfully I'm not, but I think I would go after that maybe a little more aggressively. But so far, the top three vote getters have really been hesitant to question maybe the morality, if you will, of Donald Trump and the Trump candidacy.
It's interesting that you bring up that kind of witch hunt idea, because that's something that Donald Trump has even said himself, is that every single time they attack him with whatever accusation or lawsuit or whatever it may be, his numbers grow, right? Or his camp at least becomes more firm in the fact that he should be president. And we're not seeing those attack ads feature him whatsoever. And even on the debate stage, they were pretty hesitant about how they were going to attack him and what specific issues they were going to attack him on. And I wanted to go through the Morning Consult poll results that came out this week. We have Donald Trump at 66%, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis both at 11%. We have Vivek Ramaswamy at 6%, Chris Christie at 4%, and Asa Hutchinson at 1%. What do you think is the purpose of them not attacking him? Is it because that they want to open that door to allow them to maybe have a cabinet seat or running mate status? They just don't want to poke the bear too much?
I don't think it's probably that, Sarah. I think probably their internal polling demonstrates that if they were to go after him, that nothing good will come out of that. It would be very surprised if any of those persons, certainly DeSantis and Ambassador Haley, if either one of them would want to serve within the Trump administration. I think they have their own policy realms. They both themselves have been executives of fairly large states. And so, playing second fiddle to that is probably not in their political universe, if you will. Certainly, Haley did when she went to the UN as a former governor to represent the United States at the United Nations under the Trump administration. But I think still there is this sense that if you come out too aggressively against him, except for Chris Christie, and you gotta love a guy from New Jersey who's willing to come out and swing punches or take punches. But he has the least to lose, really, when you talk about the polling, as you just did, Sarah. And so he can be a little more honest, there. But it really is a curiosity, and I think that when you look at how the other also rans, right, in the state of Iowa, how they want to move forward. I think that both DeSantis and certainly the ambassador have their work cut out for them, but they also have a vision in terms of how to get there. So we haven't seen Chris Christie here in the state of Iowa, probably for a good reason, right? He's focused largely on the East Coast. Much better known out there as a former governor, of course, New Jersey, has really focused on New Hampshire as well. So we haven't seen him here very much. But when you pay attention to the DeSantis and particularly the Haley campaigns, both of them, I think, have no expectation of winning Iowa. But we oftentimes say in the caucuses that you have to accomplish three things. The first thing you have to do is you have to show that you are organized. And several of the candidates have done a 99 county tour here in the state of Iowa, made famous from our senior senator, Chuck Grassley here, who attempts to do that every year, visiting all 99 counties. We've seen candidates do that as well. So you have to show that you are organized. And Iowa's a pretty small state, but it does take a lot of organization there. You also have to demonstrate that your message resonates. And we see that from candidates. And sometimes we get kind of a surprise that will come through the state of Iowa, such as the former governor from Arkansas, Mr. Huckabee, Reverend Huckabee. Also, we see others who sometimes created what we call a January or February surprise. So you have to show those people in South Carolina and New Hampshire that you're viable. So you have to be viable. You have to have organization. The third thing is to move forward from Iowa. You have to exceed expectations. So what I mean by that, Sarah, is that you have to do better than you're predicted to do. Because if you do worse than you're predicted to do, well, then that's really bad, not only for publicity moving forward, but we oftentimes say that the caucuses and sequential elections, as a former colleague of mine over at the University of Iowa used to call it, sequential elections are all about performance and expectations. And if you do better than expected, then that's a good thing for you in terms of your campaign, not only in terms of publicity, because of the fact that people don't always care so much about policy, but they oftentimes care about, well, how are you doing? So we call this that horse race coverage. And so if you do better than expected, not only are you going to get more publicity, but you're also going to get more money coming into your campaign as well. So those are really the three things we talk about: organization, resonate your message, getting out amongst the population, and then doing better, or at least as good as you're supposed to be doing there. So it really is a long race moving forward. And I think that this is really where everybody other than Trump is focused in terms of, after Iowa, after New Hampshire, what's our game plan? Will we have the money and will we have the resources to move forward?
I have to ask you about the ballot issues specifically, coming out of places like Colorado. For Trump, this is another, accusation against him, another kind of stone thrown, if you will. So, what does this mean for his campaign? What does this mean for Republicans? And what does this mean for his camp, who might be doubling down even more?
Well, that's a great question. My daughter, who's a freshman in a college, not unfortunately at Iowa State, but who's a freshman in college, we were sitting around and she's like, she asked the same question, Dad, what does this mean? We talk politics a lot around the dinner table. And then she kind of hit the nail on the head. She goes, well, he wasn't going to win Colorado anyhow, right? So, who cares? And I think, I think that the Trump campaign can use this as a tool. They frequently talk about, and it's kind of ironic that they talk about the courts that are legislating from the bench, right? Because we see a very conservative court that was put in place largely under the Trump years. But talk about, the courts being out of hand. This certainly was a punch in the gut to the Trump campaign, and they immediately appealed it. So currently they are on the ballot. But depending on whether or not the Supreme Court decides to hear this case or not, it will be interesting to watch as well. A lot of pundits who watch the court very closely, of course, think that the court is largely in the back pocket of the president, which is frightening to everyone, or at least it should be frightening to everyone. But I think they can use this as material, saying, look, if they can't beat us at the ballot box, and they're just going to remove us from the ballot, right? So that's a bit of the rhetoric. And from what I can tell, that's kind of a tiresome argument from the people I hear discussing, that again, kind of that fake news mentality, and people are kind of tiring of that. So it'll be interesting to see, certainly, Sarah, what happens in those cases, whether or not the Supreme Court, who has not really indicated one way or the other, but I'm sure they're kind of hesitant to jump in on that discussion, where that will head. My ultimate guess would be that when push comes to shove, that his name will be on those ballots. And again, probably won't do terribly well in Colorado, and probably not great in Maine either. But if this is a strategy that seems to be working for the Dems, and I'm not saying the Democrats are behind this, but I'm sure, it's just another feather in the cap of the many feathers that are in Mr. Trump's hat right now, that they will try to utilize this to their own political gain as well.
If our viewers watch a lot of Forbes Newsroom with Brittany Lewis, they will know my next question, which I have borrowed from her. What do you think is missing from the national conversation about Iowa and about the Iowa caucuses that are coming up here?
Right. Well, we get into a lot of discussions about just how representative the Iowa caucuses are. We're a Midwestern state, kind of a flyover state. Certainly, according to the coast and to the media, we're, compared to the rest of the country, overwhelmingly white. Our economics are largely agrarian, although, again, we do have a lot of real estate, a lot of insurance and whatnot in other places. And so I've heard this rhetoric, having worked at Iowa State University and growing up here, the rhetoric that we're overly white, overly represented in the process, and, just not a good representation of the nation. And it's hard to argue against that, Sarah, certainly there. However, trying to defend my, cash cow here in the state of Iowa. However, those three things that I mentioned earlier, in terms of, can you organize, right? Does your message resonate? And can you perform as well as expected, or hopefully better? I think those are really good tests of a campaign. When President Obama won the presidency, he came to Iowa, and he was the first one to really use the internet to organize people and get out the vote. And certainly with Howard Dean as the head of the DNC at that time, they had a strategy in terms of how to win Iowa. Likewise, all the candidates we see running around now, Sarah, for the last couple of years, know they have to go to the state fair, know they have to flip, as hokey as it might appear, know they have to flip pork sandwiches and what have you. And so it does serve as a good way to test the viability of a candidate. Now, certainly, we're aware of the importance as a political science professor here, Sarah. We're always excited, of course, to have candidates running around, and it's a little more fun when a president has faced 2 terms. And we have a bunch of Dems and a bunch of Republicans running around here. But the caucuses at the end of the day do test viability, do test organization, and do test whether or not the person's message is resonating with the public. Now, the polls are the polls, right? And we know the scientific methods behind the polls, and we know Mr. Trump is well ahead. But what really matters is that vote that Monday night, a cold February night. It used to be a January night, but a cold February night, whether or not people will come out and not only stump speech for Mr. Trump, but will actually be willing then to cast their kind of sacred caucus vote for him. Likewise, the ground game is really important. As a registered Republican here in the state of Iowa, I get a lot of calls, a lot of texts. We've seen, of course, the world change in terms of how campaigns are run. And so the Haley campaign, DeSantis campaign are spending just a ton of money here, as are their super PACs, Sarah, we should mention that as well, are just spending a ton of money here for a second or a third place finish. So I think that while Iowa's overly white, overly ag-centric, if you will, and maybe overly not representative of the population at large, it does create a good test for viability for a candidate and whether or not that candidate's message will resonate beyond Iowa, beyond New Hampshire, into other places where elections are won or lost.
One of my interviews earlier today talked about it. It's not an attendance record, though. Even though you come, it's not about, how many events did you show up to? It's about how many people were you able to interact with? And we'll have to see how that turns out for our candidates here in the next 2 weeks on January 15th at the Iowa caucuses. Kelly Shaw, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Of course, Sarah, thank you. And thanks for covering Iowa politics.